He was just a starving stray with pleading eyes, but when he silently asked, "Can I eat with you?" a single moment of kindness sparked a lifelong bond that melted millions of hearts. It was early morning, still a little dark, and the streets were empty and cold. Officer James McAllister had just started his shift. He was a kind-hearted policeman, someone who didn't just do his duty but cared about people and even animals. That day, the wind was strong and the sky was gray. James pulled his coat tighter and held a small thermos of coffee in his hands to keep warm. He had parked his patrol car at the edge of an old shopping center lot that had been mostly abandoned. It was one of the quieter parts of town, just a few old buildings, cracked pavement, and lots of trash lying around. Nothing exciting usually happened there. But today would be different. As he stood there sipping his coffee, thinking about how slow the morning was going to be, he noticed something moved near a pile of garbage close to a dumpster. It was a very soft, cautious movement, almost like a shadow shifting. James narrowed his eyes and took a step forward. At first, he thought it might be a raccoon or maybe a cat. But as he got closer, he saw it clearly. It was a dog, stray. Dog, thin as a skeleton, its fur full of dirt and patches missing. The dog looked like it hadn't eaten in days. It was shaking from the cold, its tail tucked tightly between its legs. One of its paws looked hurt, and its eyes were sad-tired, and scared but also curious. James stopped walking. He didn't want to scare the poor thing. He knelt down slowly and reached into his pocket, pulling out the half sandwich he had planned to eat later. It was nothing fancy, just a turkey and cheese sandwich wrapped in foil. He carefully unwrapped it and placed a small piece on the ground, a few feet away from him. Then he waited. The dog didn't move at first. It stared at the sandwich, then at James, unsure what to do. James kept his eyes soft, his voice calm. "It's okay, buddy," he said gently. "You're hungry, huh?" The dog tilted its head slightly, almost like it understood. Then slowly, it stepped forward. Each movement was cautious, like the dog expected to be hit or chased away. It sniffed the sandwich, then looked up again. That's when something strange happened. Instead of just gobbling the food and running, the dog sat down. Right there on the cold pavement, only a few feet from James. It looked at him, not just a normal look, but something more. Its eyes locked onto his, and for a second, James felt like the dog was trying to speak without words. Its head tilted. Again, and its eyes seemed to say, "Can I eat with you? Not just can I have food, but can I be with you? Sit beside you, and be safe for a while." James was touched, felt a lump in his throat. He had seen many things during his years as an officer: crimes, pain, loss, but sometimes the quietest moments hit the hardest. He nodded softly and tore off another piece of his sandwich. This time, he didn't throw it far. He placed it right next to him and sat down on the curb, his coffee in one hand, sandwiched in the other. The dog watched him carefully, then slowly crawled over and sat beside him. Still shaking, still unsure, but closer now. It took the piece of sandwich gently, chewing quietly. James took a bite of his own, and they ate together like two old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. That moment was simple, but powerful. A tired officer and a starving dog, sharing a quiet meal on a cold morning. There was no crowd, no cameras, no noise. Just a bond forming between two souls who needed a little comfort. James stayed there longer than he planned to. Rest of his sandwich to the dog and opened the last cookie from his lunchbox, breaking it in half so they could share that too. The dog's tail wagged slightly. Not fast, not excited, just a soft little wag that said thank you. From time to time, cars passed by, but no one stopped. They didn't see what was happening. But James knew he'd remember this moment for a long time. The dog looked at him one last time before slowly getting up and walking back toward the dumpster. But this time, it didn't disappear fully into the shadows. It sat nearby, watching James like it wasn't ready to say goodbye yet. As James stood up and dusted off his uniform, he looked back and said, "I'll come back tomorrow, buddy. You be here, okay?" He wasn't even sure if the dog would understand, but deep down, he hoped it would. When he returned to his patrol car, James couldn't stop thinking about the dog. He had seen many strays before, but this one felt different. There was something in its eyes, something that said this dog hadn't just been hungry for food, but hungry for kindness, for safety, for a moment of peace, all day long. The memory of that shared breakfast stuck in his mind. The soft look in the dog's eyes, the way it asked for company without saying a word, and the strange warmth James felt in his heart when they sat side by side. He didn't even care that he had skipped his breakfast for it. In fact, it was the best morning he'd had in a long time. And that's how it all began. It's a simple question from a starving animal, not spoken out loud, but loud enough to touch a heart. Can I eat with you? That question would soon change not only the dog's life, but James's too. The next morning, the sky was just beginning to lighten, and cold fog floated across the empty streets. Officer James McAllister drove slowly through the neighborhood, his eyes searching the familiar corners of the street where he had met the starving dog the day before. He couldn't stop thinking about it all night. The dog's eyes haunted him not in a bad way, but in a deep way, like they had reached into his heart and left a quiet message behind. He didn't know if the dog would be there again. Maybe it had run off. Maybe someone else had taken it, or maybe something worse had happened. Still, James had packed a small meal in his bag, some leftover chicken, bread, and even a small packet of scrambled eggs. He had also brought a clean towel and an old blanket from home. He wanted to be ready, just in case. As he pulled up near the same abandoned shopping lot, he slowed down and parked in the same spot as yesterday. The street was silent, the building still asleep. He stepped out of his patrol car and looked around, but he didn't see anything at first. The same garbage bin stood in the corner, with old boxes and broken crates beside it. Then, just as he was about to walk toward the building, he heard a soft sound, a tiny bark, barely a whisper. He turned, and there he was. The dog was sitting quietly behind the same dumpster, its eyes wide and alert. It didn't bark again. It just looked at James and waited, not with fear this time, but with hope. James smiled and knelt down again. "Hey there, you came back," he said softly. He reached into his bag and took out a piece of chicken, setting it gently on the ground. The dog didn't run away this time. It walked slowly but with more confidence than the day before. Its ribs were still showing, and its fur was still dirty and full of patches, but there was a little more life in its steps. It came close, sniffed the chicken, then looked up at James again. Then it did something James didn't expect it. It sat right next to him. Not a few feet away like yesterday, but close enough that its side touched James's leg. It didn't flinch. It didn't try to run. It just sat, waiting to eat with him. Again, James pulled out the rest of the food and shared it piece by piece, talking to the dog as if they were old friends. "You hungry, huh? I brought the good stuff today. Chicken. Real chicken. You're lucky, buddy." The dog chewed slowly, and every now and then it would look up at him as if it understood every word. That quiet trust was growing fast. James took out the clean towel and gently placed it on the ground. The dog sniffed it and then stepped onto it like it knew it was for him. When James reached out his hand, the dog didn't back away this time. It let him pet its head, though its body still shook a little. James ran his hand gently down its neck, feeling the bones beneath the skin. The poor thing was so thin, it almost felt like touching sticks covered in fur. "You need help, don't you?" James whispered. "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." More time passed, and eventually James had to return to his patrol. But this time, the goodbye felt different. The dog didn't hide behind the dumpster. It stood at the edge of the lot and watched as James got into his car. James looked back through the mirror and raised a hand. "I'll be back. Same time. Tomorrow, you better be here." That promise became a new habit. Every morning after that, James came to the same spot. And every morning, the dog, who he now called Shadow, was waiting for him. Each day, Shadow came a little closer, trusted a little more, and ate a little better. By the end of the week, Shadow was no longer trembling when James touched him. He would wag his tail slightly and even nuzzle against James's arm when he sat down one morning. James brought a dog bowl filled with warm rice and boiled chicken. Shadow sniffed it and gave one small bark, the first real sound James had heard from him. It made James smile wider than he had in weeks. It wasn't just food they were sharing now. It was something more powerful: companionship. Gone from a terrified stray hiding in the shadows to a calm, quiet friend who waited every morning for a man in uniform who never turned him away. Other officers began to notice. They'd drive by during patrols and spot James sitting cross-legged on the pavement, a dog leaning against him, both of them eating breakfast like it was the most normal thing in the world. One day, one of the officers, Maria, rolled down her window and laughed. "You've got a new partner, huh?" James just grinned and nodded. "Best one I've ever had." Maria took a photo from her car and later posted it online with a small caption. "Officer shares his breakfast with a four-legged friend every morning. This is what kindness looks like." That photo spread fast. People online fell in love with the image. A tired-looking police officer in full uniform, sitting on cold concrete, next to a thin, broken dog who looked at him like he was the only safe place left in the world. The post was shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from everywhere, people saying they cried, people saying this reminded them that there was still good in the world. James wasn't trying to be a hero. He didn't even know the photo had gone viral until a coworker showed him. But deep down, he was glad people saw it, not because he wanted attention, but because he wanted people to care about animals like Shadow, wanted them to understand that sometimes, even the smallest gesture could mean the world to someone who had nothing. Shadow was becoming more than a stray now. James was trying to figure out what to do next. He thought about calling animal control, but he knew most strays didn't survive long in the system. Shadow was still too scared of people, still too sickly. James wanted to take him home, but department rules were strict, and his apartment complex didn't allow dogs. Yet every time Shadow looked at him with those deep brown eyes, James felt more and more like he couldn't leave him out there much longer. He started asking around, checking with shelters and rescue centers. Most were full. A few offered help, but only temporary. Still, James kept trying, kept hoping, and kept showing up every morning with food, blankets, and care. He began calling Shadow by name out loud. "Come here, Shadow." And to his surprise, the dog started responding, tail wagging, head lifting, legs moving slowly toward him. Shadow was learning to trust, maybe for the first time in his life. One morning, after they had finished breakfast, James stayed longer. He had brought a brush and tried gently cleaning some of the matted fur. Shadow let him. For nearly an hour, James sat brushing the dog, pulling out bits of dirt and knots, and Shadow just lay there, still and calm, eyes half closed. That was the moment James realized something. This dog wasn't just a part of his routine now. He was a part of his life. And in a strange way, Shadow had filled something in James too. He didn't talk about it much, but James had been lonely for a long time. Long shifts, no family nearby, just an empty apartment waiting at the end of every day. But now there was something to look forward to. A friend waiting with silent eyes. And a hungry heart who didn't care about badges or titles, just kindness. And in return, James gave Shadow the one thing he had never truly known, someone who wouldn't walk away. Their quiet breakfasts continued. Side by side, day after day, what started with a simple look, a starving dog asking silently, "Can I eat with you?" to become the beginning of something far deeper than James ever expected. And this was just the beginning. Every morning felt different now for Officer James McAllister. Earlier, his mornings started with routine patrols, paperwork, cold coffee, and empty streets. But now, his mornings started with something warm, something that felt like purpose. Each sunrise, he packed a breakfast not just for himself, but for Shadow too, the stray dog, who would slowly become his closest companion. Without saying a single word, James had started adding better things to their shared meal. He brought chicken, scrambled eggs, little pieces of cooked meat, and sometimes even a treat or two. Shadow had started eating better, looking a bit healthier, and walking with more strength. Once patchy and dull, had started to show small signs of softness. His ribs were still visible, but he was gaining weight slowly. The first week he barely came near. But now, Shadow waited at the same spot every morning like he knew the timing exactly. One morning, when James parked his patrol car near the same broken parking lot, Shadow was already sitting on the sidewalk, tail gently tapping the ground. James stepped out and called, "Morning, partner," and Shadow barked once, as if saying the same. That little bark was enough to bring a smile to James's face. No matter how tired or cold the day was, Shadow wasn't just a hungry dog anymore. He had become a part of James's life. Every breakfast they shared was quiet, peaceful. Sometimes James talked to Shadow about the day ahead, about work, or about nothing at all. Shadow just listened, sitting beside him, sometimes resting his head on James's leg. It was strange how safe they both felt in each other's presence. A man and a dog, both filling the silence that used to feel too heavy. Soon, other people began to notice them. One day, a bakery worker across the street saw James sitting with the dog and walked over with a small bag. "For your friend," she smiled, handing over some warm bread. James was surprised, but thankful. Shadow sniffed the bread, licked the woman's hand gently, and then looked at James for approval. It made the woman laugh softly. "He's got manners," she said. After that day, more people began bringing things. A cup of broth, leftover steak, even a small toy ball. Shadow became a familiar sight, like a little guardian of the street. Some children passed by one morning and waved at James, then bent down to try and pet Shadow. At first, Shadow stepped back, nervous. But when James nodded, he stayed still. The kids gently patted him, giggling when his tail wagged. James began posting photos of their mornings together on his social media. He wasn't expecting much. But one picture where Shadow had rested his head on James's shoulder got shared. More than 100,000 times. People from all over the world commented things like, "This is what love looks like. You gave him hope. And he trusts you more than anyone else ever did." Suddenly, news stations started calling. A local journalist reached out and asked if they could do a story. James wasn't a fan of attention, but he agreed only because he wanted more people to care about animals like Shadow. The article was called "A Breakfast Bond." How one officer found a friend in a stray went viral within hours. Donations started pouring into the local animal shelter. Some people even sent warm jackets and blankets for Shadow. Others sent letters, saying the story gave them comfort during hard times. One old man wrote, "I lost my wife last year, but watching your friendship with that dog made me smile for the first time in months." James was overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers. They also knew Shadow didn't care about fame or stories. All Shadow cared about was whether James would show up again tomorrow, and he always did. One day, James brought a leash with him. He didn't clip it on immediately. Instead, he let it sit beside Shadow during breakfast. Shadow sniffed it, looked at James, and didn't back away. The next day, James gently placed it around Shadow's neck, but didn't pull. Let Shadow walk beside him with the leash loose, no pressure. Shadow followed calmly. That was their first walk together. They walked along the quiet path behind the parking lot, near the old warehouses. Shadow kept checking James's face, as if making sure he was doing okay. And James kept looking down, smiling proudly. "You're getting good at this," he whispered. Shadow's tail wagged like crazy. After that, their morning meetings turned into longer walks. Shadow began exploring more, sniffing trees, chasing little birds, even rolling on the grass. His eyes weren't just sad anymore. They had a sparkle. Now, like he had found a new reason to wake up each day, James began asking around about Shadow's past, but no one knew where he came from. No microchip, no tags, no missing dog reports. It was like Shadow had just appeared out of the silence. But James didn't mind. He wasn't interested in the past anymore. What mattered was the present hand, the future. Every morning, James started posting a photo of Shadow with a small caption like, "Day 14, he wagged his tail before. I got out of the car. Day 21, he let a child hug him today. Day 30, he chased a butterfly and smiled after." People began following the updates like a daily ritual. They said it helped them feel better. It reminded them that simple kindness could still exist in a world full of pain. One morning it started snowing. Soft white flakes drifted down as James arrived with breakfast. Shadow was already waiting, sitting under the edge of the roof. James brought out a small jacket for him, carefully wrapping it around his thin body. Shadow stood still, letting James buckle it, like he understood this was love. Later that day, James went shopping and bought a proper dog bed. He placed it in the back of his patrol car and drove to the station. He started asking about adopting Shadow. The process wasn't simple department rules, city paperwork, landlord approval, but James was patient. Shadow had waited for love his whole life. He could wait a little too. Meanwhile, Shadow started riding in the patrol car with him. At first, just for short rides around the block, then slowly for longer patrols. He'd sit in the back seat quietly, sometimes poking his head between the seats to look at James. If someone passed by the car, Shadow would lift his head proudly like he belonged there. Soon, Shadow had his own badge-shaped collar tag that said K9 Companion. Shadow. It wasn't official, but it made everyone smile. Other officers began calling Shadow their station dog. He visited schools with James, teaching kids about kindness to animals. He walked beside him during community events. He became more than just a rescue dog. He became a symbol of what quiet love could do. But none of it would have happened without that very first moment when a starving dog looked at a stranger and asked silently, "Can I eat with you?" And James had said yes. Now, weeks later, that small yes had built a world where both man and dog were healing together, learning from each other and finding peace one breakfast at a time. And this journey wasn't over yet. The bond was only growing stronger. The quiet promise between them still stood, unspoken but understood every day. I won't leave you. Not now, not ever. It was a cold morning, even colder than usual. The wind was sharp, and the sky was covered with thick gray clouds. Officer James McAllister arrived at the usual spot, just like he had been doing every morning for the past few weeks. He had packed a warm breakfast in a small container, boiled chicken, scrambled eggs, and some biscuits. He had also brought a new chew toy for Shadow. The bond between them had grown so strong now that James couldn't imagine starting his day without seeing him. But as he parked his car and stepped out, he noticed something was wrong. The place looked the same, quiet and empty, but Shadow was not there. James waited for a few minutes, thinking maybe Shadow was running a little late. Maybe he had gone for a walk or was playing around nearby. But deep down, he felt a strange tightness in his chest. Shadow was never late. He was always there, sitting patiently, waiting for breakfast and for James's familiar voice. James called out, "Shadow, buddy, you here?" His voice echoed softly through the empty lot, but no answer came. He began walking around, checking behind the dumpster near the old crates, even under the broken staircase of the abandoned building nearby, but there was no sign of Shadow. Wind howled quietly as James's heart began to pound. He checked around the corner near the alley behind the lot. He walked down the sidewalk, calling Shadow's name again and again. Still nothing. Now panic was setting in. Thoughts raced through his mind. What if Shadow got hurt? What if someone took him? What if he got lost? Or worse? James shook his head, trying to push away the fear. He searched for over an hour, walking through nearby streets, checking every possible hiding spot. His uniform was getting dusty, his hands were cold, and his heart was heavy. Then, just as he was about to return to his patrol car to think of the next step, he heard a low, weak whine. He turned quickly, eyes scanning the narrow alley beside an old laundromat. And there, under a rusted car parked behind a trash bin, he saw a pair of tired brown eyes looking up at him. It was Shadow, but he wasn't wagging his tail. He wasn't barking or moving. He was lying on his side, trembling, his fur soaked and dirty. His breathing was slow and uneven. Shadow. James rushed over and dropped to his knees. He gently pulled Shadow out from under the car, his hands shaking. The dog whimpered softly, but didn't resist. That was the most frightening part. Shadow was always gentle, but never this quiet. James took off his jacket and wrapped Shadow in it. He could feel the dog's ribs even more clearly now. Shadow's body felt weaker than before. his head resting limply on James's arm. "You're gonna be okay," James whispered. "I got you, I promise." Without wasting another second, he carried Shadow to his patrol car and placed him carefully on the back seat, laying the blanket and towel underneath. Then he turned the heater on full and drove straight to the nearest vet hospital. The car ride felt longer than it actually was. James kept glancing into the back mirror, watching Shadow's chest rise and fall, slowly and heavily. When he reached the vet, he didn't wait for anyone. He rushed inside, holding Shadow tightly in his arms. The staff immediately noticed the urgency and took Shadow from him gently. A young vet named Dr. Emily came forward and asked quick questions. James answered them all without thinking. He remembered every detail about Shadow's behavior, food, past injuries, and everything else he could provide. They took Shadow into an emergency room while James sat in the waiting area, heart pounding, fists clenched. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, after what seemed like forever, Dr. Emily came out. Her face was serious but calm. She sat down beside James and said, "Your dog is suffering from a severe infection, likely caused by untreated wounds and long-term malnutrition. He's also dehydrated. We're going to do everything we can, but he's in critical condition." James didn't speak. He just nodded slowly, his eyes wet but steady. Shadow was more than just a dog now. He was family. He was a reason to smile every morning. The thought of losing him was like losing a part of himself. "I want to stay with him," James said quietly, "as long as I'm allowed." The vet staff understood. They gave James a small space near Shadow's recovery room, where he sat for hours, watching the machines, stroking Shadow's head, whispering words of comfort. Sometimes Shadow opened his eyes, just for a second, and looked at James. Even in pain, there was trust in his eyes. It gave James hope. The next few days were slow and painful. Shadow was on for fluids and medications. He couldn't eat on his own, so James hand-fed him soft food. He brought in the toy he had bought earlier and placed it near Shadow's bed. He even played soft music from his phone, hoping it would calm him. James called in leave from work. He couldn't go on patrol, not when his partner was fighting for his life. Other officers stepped in to cover his shifts, many of them sending texts and gifts for Shadow. The community that had followed their story online sent care packages, prayers and cards with drawings of Shadow. Each night, James lay on a small cot beside Shadow's bed. He didn't care about the discomfort, just wanted to be there in case Shadow opened his eyes and needed him, and slowly, very slowly, Shadow started to respond. On the 4th day, he licked James's hand weakly. On the 6th, he managed to sit up for a few seconds, and on the 7th day, he ate a full bowl of food on his own. The vet smiled and said, "He's a fighter. He's not giving up." Neither was James. Every little improvement felt like a miracle. Shadow was not just recovering, he was coming back to life. His tail moved again. His eyes had more light. His body had more strength. By the end of the 2nd week, Shadow was strong enough to walk around the clinic slowly. James walked beside him with a leash, cheering him on like a proud father. The nurses clapped and took pictures. It was clear now Shadow was going to survive. When the vet finally said, "He's ready to go home," James smiled, but then paused. Home. He still lived in an apartment that didn't allow dogs. But there was no way he was letting Shadow go. Not now, not ever. So he made a decision, spoke to his landlord, explained everything, and even showed them the viral news story. After some back and forth, the landlord agreed to make an exception. James went out that night and bought a proper dog bed, toys, food bowls, and even a name tag that read, "Shadow loved and protected." He signed the final adoption papers the next morning. And when Shadow stepped out of the clinic and into James's car again, it was no longer just a ride. It was a ride home. People online cheered. The post of Shadow leaving the vet with James got millions of likes. It wasn't just about a man and a dog anymore. It was about loyalty, hope, and never giving up on someone, no matter how broken they seem. James looked at Shadow lying peacefully in the back seat and softly said, "You asked to eat with me. Now you'll eat with me forever, Shadow." With his eyes half closed, wagged his tail. That reply, silent but full of meaning, melted hearts around the world, and their story wasn't finished yet. The morning sun was rising slowly, casting a warm golden light over the quiet streets. Officer James McAllister stood outside his small apartment building with a leash in his hand. On the other end of that leash stood Shadow the dog, who once lived in fear and hunger, but now looked healthier, stronger, and loved. His fur had grown back in most places, and his eyes, once filled with sadness, now sparkled with trust and peace. He stood tall beside James, tail wagging gently, nose sniffing the air, as if he could sense that life had changed forever. It had been 3 weeks since Shadow left the vet's office and entered his new life. James had done everything to prepare. For him, he bought soft bedding, tasty food, chew toys, and even a special pillow where Shadow could rest his head near James's bed. But more than that, James gave Shadow what he had never truly had before: security, consistency, and unconditional love. Every day now began with a new rhythm. Instead of driving straight to work alone, James would first take Shadow for a walk around the block. The neighbors who had once seen a skinny, dirty stray now greeted a proud, calm companion. Some waved, others offered treats. A few asked to pet him. Shadow, who had once flinched at every sound, now welcomed gentle hands and wagged his tail with ease. Shadow even had a favorite spot on the walking path beneath a large tree near the sidewalk. He would always stop there, sniff the grass, then sit for a few moments while James stood beside him. It was almost like he remembered how far he had come. Soon after bringing Shadow home, James got permission from the police department to let Shadow ride along with him on certain patrol days. He wasn't a trained canine officer, but he was quiet, calm, and friendly, and people loved seeing him. So with the approval of the chief and the support of the town, Shadow became a kind of honorary helper. He even wore a small vest that said Community Dog Shadow. The very first time Shadow rode in the patrol car again, it was different from before. He didn't lie down nervously or hide. He sat upright, looking out the window as they drove, tongue out, ears perked. He was curious and alert, but most of all, relaxed. He knew he was safe. He knew he belonged. James drove through the same neighborhood where they had first met, and Shadow looked at every corner with familiarity. When they reached the old abandoned parking lot, James parked for a few minutes and got out with Shadow. They walked over to the spot near the dumpster where they had once shared that first sandwich. Shadow sniffed around and then looked up at James, almost as if remembering everything too. James sat on the curb, it's just like that first day, and patted the space beside him. "Still our place, huh?" Shadow came over and sat next to him, resting, his head on James's lap. It was quiet, peaceful, and powerful. No words were needed. They'd come full circle. Later that week, James was invited to speak at a local elementary school about his work as a police officer. He decided to bring Shadow along. When the children saw the dog walk in with his badge-shaped collar tag and calm eyes, they cheered. James told them about how he met Shadow, about the importance of kindness, and about how sometimes helping someone, even a dog, can change your life. The children sat wide-eyed, listening to every word. Some asked if they could pet him. Others asked if they could draw pictures for him. By the end of the visit, Shadow had received a stack of colorful drawings, each with hearts and words like Hero Dog, Thank You Shadow, and Best Friend. James took them home and pinned them on a wall in his apartment. The story of Shadow continued to spread. News channels did updates, websites published follow-up articles. People sent letters from different countries, some saying how Shadow's journey gave them hope. Some sharing stories of how they had rescued dogs of their own after reading about him. One woman wrote, "I lost my son in a car crash and I stopped smiling for months. But seeing your story reminded me that healing is possible. Thank you." Another wrote, "I was homeless and felt invisible. I saw your photo of you and Shadow sitting on the sidewalk sharing breakfast and it made me cry. I felt seen, I felt love." James never expected such a reaction, but he was thankful. Not for the attention, but for the kindness. For the way one small act Sharing food with a stray had created a ripple of goodness in the world. Shadow,
Oh.
of course, didn't understand all the fame, but he understood love. He knew his routine. He knew when James grabbed his leash in the morning, it meant adventure. He knew that his food bowl would always be full, that his bed would always be soft, that his person would always return home at the end of the day. One evening, James sat with Shadow on the apartment balcony, watching the city lights flicker. Below, Shadow lay beside him, head resting gently on his foot. James looked down and smiled. "You saved me too, you know?" It was true. James had always been strong on the outside, but lonely on the inside. His job was tough, filled with stress, danger, and sadness. Shadow had brought something back to him: calmness, a reason to laugh again, a warmth that had been missing. Sometimes, James would talk to Shadow late at night, telling him things he never told anyone else. Shadow would just listen, always, patient, always there. And then came a day James would never forget. It was a regular morning, cool and quiet. James was getting dressed for work when Shadow came up and nudged him with his nose. James knelt down and hugged him. "You ready for work, partner?" But before they could leave, a knock came at the door. It was a woman standing nervously with a camera crew. She introduced herself as a producer from a national television show. Said they had been following Shadow's story and they wanted to do a special episode about them. It's not just about the rescue, but about the bond, the recovery, and the hope it brought others. James hesitated. He didn't like too much attention. But when he looked down at Shadow, wagging his tail, eyes bright, he nodded. It helped someone, why not? The episode was filmed over a week. Cameras followed James and Shadow on patrol, during walks, and even inside the old lot where their story began. They shared everything: the fear, the friendship, the healing. When the show finally aired, millions of people watched it. Shadow became a symbol of second chances, of love beyond words. After that, something even more surprising happened. James received a letter from the city. They wanted to honor both him and Shadow with a community award for compassion and service. On the day of the ceremony, hundreds gathered in the park. Children wore shirts with Shadow's face on them. The mayor gave a speech about how a simple act of kindness had united an entire town and inspired a nation. James stepped onto the stage with Shadow by his side. The crowd clapped as Shadow sat proudly, ears up, tail wagging. James looked out at the sea of faces and said he was just a dog who needed food and love. But what I didn't expect was how much I needed him to. We saved each other. After the event, someone asked James what Shadow had taught him. He replied, "Too slow, down, to look closer, to listen even when there are no words." And that sometimes one quiet act of kindness can start a story bigger than you ever imagined. That night, as James and Shadow returned home, the world felt full of light. Not because of awards or fame, but because love, real love, had grown. From one tiny moment when a broken dog looked up and asked silently, "Can I eat with you?" And the answer he asked had changed everything. From that day on, wherever James went, Shadow went too. From dark mornings to bright afternoons, from empty streets to crowded events, they remained side by side. A man who once walked alone, a dog who once had no name, now together always. Shadow was no longer just a stray. He was home forever.